Well, thank you, Joanne. Good morning, everybody. As you all know, because Congress failed to agree on a package of fiscal reforms last year, roughly $500 billion in tax increases and automatic spending cuts are scheduled to take effect on the 1st of next month. It's called the fiscal cliff because if those budget cuts and tax increases aren't fixed and are allowed to last for the remainder of 2013, it could push our economy back into a recession or even worse. Now, the tax portion of the cliff will come from the expiration of the so-called Bush tax cuts, and that's going to occur on December 31st. If all those cuts expire, the average tax hike on middle-class families here in our state and around the country will be roughly $2,200 per year. To avoid the cliff, Congress and the President must agree on a significant deficit reduction down payment before the end of the year, about $4 trillion. Now, as he said during his re-election campaign, the President is insisting on a balanced approach to deficit reduction that includes both spending cuts and more revenue, otherwise known as tax increases. But the President has made it clear that he will not support a deal that puts a disproportionate share of the burden on middle and lower income families. For that reason, both the President and the members of this coalition believe it's necessary to reach a deal on revenue first. Because if there isn't enough revenue, the difference would have to be made up through even bigger cuts to programs that regular people and working people depend on. So what exactly is it that we and the President are asking Ohio's congressional delegation to accept? Now, despite what you may hear from the Republicans, we are not proposing to soak the rich or to raise taxes even a dime for 98% of Americans. Our plan, and listen to this carefully, is to extend the Bush tax cuts for everyone on the first $250,000 a year that they earn, and then tax income over that amount at just the Clinton-era levels. Now, for those who like numbers, we are specifically proposing that the top marginal income tax rate should increase from the current 35% to 39.6%, which is what it was under Bill Clinton, and that the second highest tax rate go from 33% to 35%. Now, doing this, along with letting most or all of the other Bush-era tax cuts expire, like those on capital gains in the states and dividend income, would bring in roughly $1.6 trillion in revenue over the next 10 years. Once Republicans agree to raise this revenue, the President has made it clear that he's willing to compromise with them on all the other things like budget cuts and entitlement reform that must be done to achieve another $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion in deficit reduction. In our view, our plan, is not only reasonable, it's exactly what the majority of Americans and Ohioans want. And how do we know what a majority of Ohioans want? Because no issue was more defining in the election we just had a month ago than that of taxes. President Obama explicitly campaigned on ending the Bush tax cuts for the richest 2% of taxpayers, and Governor Romney was just as clear in saying that the wealthy should not pay a higher tax rate. Not only did a majority of voters side with the President by re-electing him, but exit polls taken on Election Day, along with every major national poll over the past 2 years, including one just this week by the Washington Post and ABC News, have shown that 60% of Americans favor higher taxes for the rich as part of a balanced budget deal. Now, despite all this evidence, the Republicans say, at the moment, that they're not willing to raise tax rates on the richest Americans at all, not even a little bit. Instead, they say we can get the revenue we need through limiting deductions and eliminating tax loopholes. This, they say, is their compromise offer. But there are 3 things wrong with this so-called compromise. First, capping deductions and eliminating loopholes won't raise nearly as much money as higher tax rates on the top 2%. Second, limiting deductions could hurt many middle-class families, especially those who have large mortgage interest payments or live in high-tax states. And third, think about this Republican compromise for a minute. Capping deductions and eliminating tax loopholes was, in fact, Mitt Romney's tax plan, which means that the Republican compromise consists of asking the guy who won the election to adopt the loser's campaign platform. Now, call me crazy, but I don't think that's what most people have in mind when they think of the word compromise. So the President and the Ohio Coalition, the Ohio Action Coalition, have a better idea, one that we believe makes perfect sense and is eminently reasonable. Since everyone, Republicans and Democrats alike, agrees that the Bush tax cut should not expire for anyone earning less than $250,000 a year, Congress and the President should start there. Everyone agrees, so let's lock that in. That would mean that taxes don't go up at the end of this year for 98% of all Americans, and then the two sides can continue to negotiate over the tax rates for the richest 2%, as well as over the spending cuts that will be needed to keep us from going over the cliff. So, if that seems reasonable to you too, what's the problem? The problem is that Republicans are so dead set on protecting millionaires and billionaires and the rest of the 2% that they're holding the other 98% of Americans hostage. They say they won't vote to extend the Bush tax cuts for middle-class families unless the wealthy get a bonus tax cut, above and beyond the cuts that they, like everyone else, will get on the first $250,000 that they earn. Now, the Republicans, of course, make lots of arguments about why the wealthy paying slightly higher tax rates would be bad for job creation, bad for small business, bad for the economy in general. We believe that most of those arguments are just flatly untrue, and we'd be happy to explode the myths around each of them during the question and answer period. But for now, let me conclude my remarks by saying that we really and truly hope Congress and the President can avoid going over the fiscal cliff by reaching a fair and just agreement before the end of the year. And toward that end, we in this coalition will do everything we can to persuade Ohio's congressional delegation that asking the wealthy to pay a little more is an indispensable first step in reaching a fair deficit reduction agreement. We also intend to educate regular Ohioans about what is at stake for them in this debate. Next week, Innovation Ohio will release a report showing what middle-class families stand to lose if sufficient revenue isn't raised and deficit reduction has to be achieved through budget cuts alone. In the meantime, we have a sneak preview of the kinds of things you'll be hearing in that report. With us today is Ohio State University student Sara Valentine, who will tell us what deep budget cuts in college student loan programs would mean for her and many of her fellow students.